Gaibeh sé Wendy Greyeyes Leatricia, 20 Nishna, though 20 Bushes Chi is a Thanadesh Chi, no Twachanadesh another. And I am from Kenta, Arizona, from Twanadesh, and I guess being the fellow for this past year has been really exciting. I think it's a dream come true for any Navajo scholar who's out there to come back and actually be asked to come back to do research on a topic that is, of importance to the Navajo Nation. So I was really grateful, in terms of being able to be here for a full year. And I can't say that, you can't really be a full fellow until you actually take courses from the faculty here. And I'm just really appreciative that my teachers actually showed up. Mr. David Nez, who taught me the Navajo Fundamental Law course, and he did a really fabulous job for that class. But also Michelle Whitstone, who was my Navajo language teacher. And she did open up, and one thing that I did take from her course that was very powerful for me is, having the courage to be wrong. And, and I think as you learn your Navajo language, that's always a teaching that, we don't do enough of, is actually articulating, building students' thick skin so that they have that courage to make mistakes, to make errors, and not feel bad about it. So I think that was something that was really insightful as a teacher for me. But then also as a fellow, I was able to reverse that role as well. I also was asked by Dean Rexley Jim to help teach a course as well. And and I had the privilege and opportunity of teaching 3 really great students who I envisioned becoming future professors here, and that's Marla, Billey, Leatricia, Bennett, and Lyle Logg. And where is Lyle Logg? Is he here? But anyway, so I think in terms of being able to reverse that role, no fellowship is actually complete without experiencing the learning from the faculty, but also being able to return that knowledge to the students in terms of their ability to learn from you as well. So that was one thing that I thought was really beautiful. So after this presentation, you'll actually get to see 3 of the graduating students in Indigenous Studies present their capstone project. So, and I'm just very indebted to the students because they taught me so much. And many people don't realize that students have such a profound impact on actually reversing and helping you learn. So where did this project come from, this idea? I really love this photo in the background, and this is my mom. You can see her pointing her finger. And she's kind of telling the story of the home site surveyor who'd come, and she was pointing out where they put in the stakes of my home site. And she's describing, where some of the meanings of this land and this state territory had in terms of the meaning for our family. But I really love that photo. It didn't come out very well on the screen. It actually should be a little more brighter. But I think in terms of that process, it is a good image of what we're talking about. So today I wanted just to cover what is Landback, what is Navajo Landback, and what the national discourse around Landback is, and how does Navajo fit into that national discourse, and then what is our history of Navajo Landback, and then my future steps in research. So when I started this project, obviously the question about what is Landback. I think all of us in this room, we all have our stories about Landback, and whether it's building a home, acquiring a home site lease, fixing or repairing our family's home, our grandma's homes, our grandparents' homes. But by building this home, we are, in essence, taking and making a claim to space and territory. So, but I think, there are many layers of what is meant by Landback. And so when I thought a little bit about in this court, and this actual fellowship, I really wanted to think about also the extreme versions of Landback. As many of you guys have read, many Indigenous activists have demanded that, you know, we fulfill this pure version of Landback, which is every immigrant who has ever occupied our country, what was known as the United States of America, should leave this country and give the entire territory back. And that's one version of Landback. But also, you know, others also argue that lands that were wrongfully taken, where treaties were violated, where people who actually occupied that territory were tricked into giving up their space and their territory and their land, you know, that should be accounted for. And so there's also that version of Landback. But I think in terms of the work itself as well, it is something that I think is very critical. And this is what I submitted my proposal for here at Diné College, was really thinking about, you know, what Landback is. Because in the United States, we literally cannot say that we're a true democracy when we continue to occupy land that we know that we've stolen from Indigenous people. And so when we think about this moral question, you know, we have to think about how this democratic society is thinking about how their responsibility is, how are they articulating reconciliation, repatriation, in terms of many of these Landback initiatives. So what I wanted to think about was how, you know, this rhetoric around democracy, about having to repair the wrongs of our colonial past, especially since we talk a lot about the recent land acknowledgements that are cropping up around universities and corporations, but also what would it mean to actually actively engage with that? You know, it would really take some time to revisit the approximately 368 treaties that were negotiated by the US commissioners and tribal leaders from 1777 to 1868. This is just the period in which the settler nation, the United States, came in and negotiated treaties with the Indigenous people. But I think the other question that we need to ask ourselves is, as Indigenous and tribal leaders, is what are we going to do with all that land once it's returned? And I think that's an important question to ponder within this discourse around the national Landback movement dialogue. And so, you know, when I was reading, I really wanted to bring Ned Blackhawk here. And he just published this book because it actually was funny because he actually poses kind of a similar question. His book, The Rediscovery of America, he asks, how can a nation founded on the homelands of dispossessed Indigenous peoples be the world's most exemplary democracy? So, and he states eloquently that this question haunts America as it does other settler nations. And I think this is a question that we, as Navajo people, we have to ask ourselves that question, primarily because we're thinking a lot of the different ways that we have pushed back on reacquiring much of the land that has been taken. And so this study is mainly much of looking at that national discourse, but also plugging in where we as Diné fit into that. So I think in terms of this next project that we're talking about, you know, that also forces me as a scholar, as an academic, to even challenge my own institution, University of New Mexico, which has this Indigenous peoples land and territory acknowledgement. And, you know, Graham Wood, I really love this essay, writes that land acknowledgements are just moral exhibitionism, meaning that these relieve the pressure of white settlers to relinquish that guilt that they feel in terms of their responsibility to Indigenous people. And one thing that I do and have experienced is that I'm the faculty advisor for the Kiva Club, and the students are just really phenomenal. But one thing that they talk a lot about is, you know, we have to pay for a lot of things for events on UNM campus. I mean, this one of the responsibilities and accountabilities of the land acknowledgement should be that the university actually pays for some of these events that they organize. So we think a lot about how do we hold our communities, especially our institutions, accountable. But, you know, and this is part of that discourse as well. And so I think in moving forward, the other part of this discourse that we have to recognize that's kind of also getting a lot of traction is the claims by Black communities. You know, I saw this Mother Jones article and I was like, whoa, this is a pretty powerful image. But even, you know, the Black Landback is something that we have to talk about in terms of our community, because Black Landback language is actually utilizing the same Indigenous language that we're utilizing for our claims to landback. And just a little history, much of these claims date back to 1865 for the 3.9 million freed Black people. Back then, when President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, he did propose giving 400,000 acres owned by white plantation owners to the freed slaves in allotments not to exceed 40 acres. So you guys might have heard, maybe in your history courses, 40 acres and a mule, right? So this is where this evolved from. But the president, after Lincoln's death, canceled this action. And he himself was considered a white plantation owner himself. But eventually, many of these Black people had no choice but to become sharecroppers, which really means they get a piece of land where they do the agricultural work on it and give a portion it to the owner, and they take a portion of that. But this led to a lot of indebtedness, where much of the cost of what they had to achieve was very, very expensive, so it caused them to lose, as they argued, generational wealth. So when we talk about democracy in this country, we have to also think about how is that measured? How are Americans measuring our progress as Indigenous people, as Blacks, as Chicana, Chicano, even Asians, you know, the minorities of this country? And many times it is about generational wealth. It's what you can give to your family and the next generation. And I love this quote by Margaret Byfield. She says, either you own property or you are property. So this is the discourse that we have to think about when we talk and frame this issue out, is thinking about the other claims that are occurring. So what is Navajo Landback? You know, before I started this fellowship, I wanted to attend the Navajo Nation Council and on their 100th year of existing. And so in terms of that session, you know, I have this photo, this press release that happened in October, but in June, Navajo Nation was debating getting and paying for Goulding's Lodge. And in that discussion, in June, the summer session, that vote died because of one vote. And listening to 2.5 days of debate over whether or not we should buy Goulding's Lodge, this really solidified my mindset about what, you know, our future depends upon in terms of thinking about buying land that we did own, but we gave away, and now we're paying a monetary value for that. But the question was, what are we inheriting? What are we inheriting from Goulding's Lodge? As much as, you know, tourism is a $1.7 trillion business, and Navajo Nation is eyeballing that arena in terms of actually trying to create economic stability for the Navajo people. You know, Goulding's Lodge itself, they identified at least 12 environmental issues that popped up, and that they knew that if that wasn't being dealt with, then they would actually have to be accountable in terms of paying for that cost of the inheritance. And so, you know, this image, you know, that one delegate who didn't vote for it, you could just feel the silence when the passage of the Goulding's Law didn't actually go in the favor of these gentlemen here who are pictured here. People were upset. People, like literally the whole room cleared out and everybody was kind of like trying to evaluate the situation. And it was just fascinating to be on the ground to listen to that conversation, because much of what we talk about, and this is something that later I thought a lot about, was what's going on with our Navajo fundamental laws. You know, was that even talked about? Was that even part of the reporting? Was that even considered in the debates? And none of that talks about that. So I'm really grateful that David Nez spent a lot of time talking about where our land and responsibility to Mother Earth lies, where our responsibility to ensuring that our future is actually made in these decisions that we know is going to have repercussions for our children. And so when we think about these issues, I knew we had to dig in a little bit deeper about what is Navajo Landback, but how decisions are being made. So I think in looking at Navajo people's future, we think we have to look at this both from the inaction versus the action. And as Diné people, both living on and off the reservation, we should be asking the larger question of how do we remove these boundaries and to think bigger for our future as a Navajo people. And as we've learned, and through even the Navajo fundamental laws, we've learned that land is central to our understanding our relationship to Nihikeyah. But going back, the other purpose of understanding Landback is we've created such a complex institution. And all my research is in education. And I asked the Navajo Land Department like 13 years ago when I was working at Dodi, hey, can you do me a map that shows all the school districts, the chapter boundaries, the agency boundaries, the state boundaries, but also our communities and where all our schools are located. And this is the map he created. And to me, it really blows my mind because where we live, where we shop, where we eat, where we educate ourselves, it really is confined by these jurisdictions that are dictated by the state, by the federal government, and rarely by the Navajo Nation in terms of our thinking about how we control what our students learn. And so just looking at it just from an education, just a small sliver from our tribal governance aspect, I think this map is so important because it is a mess. And I wrote a whole book about how, this is what I call disentangling our sovereign body. How do we disentangle ourselves as Indigenous, as Navajo, as Diné, so that we can do one thing that I know everyone is thinking right here. Why isn't she saying this in Navajo? And why? Because we don't control the curriculum, we do not control the standards, we don't control a lot of the resources that is being taught in our education system. Our education system teaches our students to get a high school degree, go to college, and get a job. And many of those jobs are not here on the Navajo Nation. And Dr. Roessel had mentioned a little over 50% of our people live off the reservation. The US Census reports it's about 70% that live off the reservation. And so we have to think about, is that our end game? I mean, in terms of looking at this Landback issue, because it's actually created a lot of tension among our people about who lives off the reservation and on the reservation. And I think in a lot of ways, people who are living off the reservation, who buy homes, who get a mortgage and do all that, they're in their way, in effect, enacting some form of Landback because they're purchasing land, but they're making it meaningful for themselves and helping to raise their family, and also being able to provide for their families through that. And so there are microcosms of Landback that are happening. So this is kind of why I wanted to do this project, is because that first book taught me one thing. From all the interviews, all the conversations, all the meetings and sessions from the history of Navajo education, is that if we don't own our land, we really don't have control or sovereign authority over our people. So what I'm looking at is how other tribal nations are looking at strategies to create power from spaces of powerlessness. Looking at how tribal nations working with the boundaries of the federal government, thinking about, and I'm using some terms of post-colonial remedy as part of our moral commitment as a democratic nation. I think we do need to start calling out the federal government, the state governments about their own way of actually holding up the Navajo Nation. And I love these photos because, you know, this is the top one, is at one of the Tuba City Agency Council meetings. You know, and people are really passionate about retaining and holding on to these actual laws and rules that control our education system. And then down here, you see Department of Education, the former Superintendent Tommy Lewis, along with Vice President at that point, Jonathan Nez, signing and President Roessel, my apologies, signing what they call the Diné School Accountability Plan. And this plan is very helpful in terms of giving schools and our nation the right to allow standards for Navajo language, culture, history, government, and character. And we actually have not, we have the rules that say it's okay to do it, but we haven't built the curriculum yet that's officially been passed through. We haven't built the resources. And it's only recently that the Navajo Nation Council approved $176,000, which was sponsored by Dr. Andy Nez, to allow us to create one book for high school students on Navajo government. And so we still have a plethora of other books and resources and textbooks that need to be developed. So that this is a very monumental moment for the Navajo Nation. I wanted to make sure that we had this in our book, or this research. But as Dr. Roessel had mentioned, you know, I invited a lot of Navajo scholars, and you know, from Nihikeyah, Dr. Lloyd Lee, who had Mario Atencio, Sean Anakai. Myself, I wrote a chapter, Rexley Jim. There's a typo right there. Manny Lowley, Jonathan Perry, Jake Skeets, and Jennifer Jackson Wheeler. Here they're talking about the different concerns around Nihikeyah, Navajo Homeland. And so, you know, I wanted to highlight how each of these individuals are contributing, but also one thing that I'm really acutely aware of is that sometimes we don't use fresh research and work in many of our courses. And that's what I did for the class that I taught. But I also wanted to talk about Carbon Sovereignty by Andrew Curley, which highlighted the coal development and his 40 interviews with anyone who worked with coal and the families impacted by coal. Ezra Roessel, who wrote A Nation Within Navajo Land and Economic Development. And this is, he said this was a primer for anyone wanting to learn about economic development in Navajo land. And then Jennifer Dale, Reclaiming Diné History, The Legacies of Chief Manilito and Juanita. And what was really nice about the contribution from this book is that she actually challenges this perspective that Navajos came to the Southwest as latecomers. And that's always something that I always read in all these books, and it irritates me. So that's another agenda that I have on writing this is, you know, trying to undermine that perspective. And the other scholars that we had were Rexley Jim, who also contributed to Nihikeyah, and Nits'áá, which is a book of poetry. And then we invited Dr. Wilkins, David Wilkins, Diné Hazani, Navajo, A Handbook of Navajo Government and the Navajo Political Experience. And then Restoring Relations through Stories from Nits'áá to Dinenta, which is Renee Watchman, who spoke last week. So through all of these, you know, one part of this fellowship journey was to understand what is the linkage, what is the conversations, what is the Navajo discourse about Landback, what is the Navajo discourse about land issues. And it's just not me. I mean, I want to build, as they say, standing on the shoulders of giants, right? These are, in Navajo, you know, the people who are writing and articulating the issues. And these are the books that are being bought up by non-natives so they can learn about us, about the Diné people. And so in my class, you know, one thing that I talked a lot about was we need to be writing our own books. But I know there's other books that I don't mention here, but I know in my class, my students took issue with because they didn't feel it was appropriate for some of those stories to be shared. So there are parts where we share, there are parts where we don't share. And my question to many of my students is, how do you hold them accountable? You do book reviews. You write back to the press, you write back to the scholarship, you write it and you tell the world what your perspective is and do a critical deconstruction of these works. So I think that's an important part of this conversation, and that's a message that I'm sending out to Diné College as well. So, just really, I'm not going to go too much into details, but protecting our lands, I think is part of the mission of why we need to study and examine land back issues. Because we've also really endured a tremendous amount of destructive practices over a sustained period of time. So, when we talk about these issues, thinking through some of those threats of settler colonialism, which is the occupancy by a nation state. We've seen us go through occupation by Spain, Mexico, and the United States. We've seen the removal of Navajo from lands. We've seen continuously the undermining of oral histories about Navajo origin on their land, and even referring to our origin stories as myths and using science to validate our stories. I mean, there was, I think, Harry Francis and Kelly, they wrote a bit about that whole issue, but also the introduction to Jennifer Danette Dell's book. I mean, she pushes back from a historical perspective these efforts to undermine our stories. But also, the bureaucratization of Navajo lands, the home site lease process. I mean, we all have our horror stories about that. But, so let me check my time real fast. Okay. Actually, let me go back. I'm going to go ahead and just jump into this. This just goes through the part of my research and stuff. So through my archive work and research, this is probably just chapter 1 of the manuscript. And, I wanted to go back to the Navajo land history. Where am I going to start? Obviously the Navajo Times. And, I wanted to go all the way back and try to read everything I could, every paper, every chapter. But I think what's really powerful about having this experience is that, the Navajo Times is a really great resource, but also working with Lottie Clark at Records Management, she's been amazing. I also learned from Ethel Branch, our Navajo Nation Attorney General, that there are some resources available at DOJ as well, but also the library, the Navajo Nation Library, there's tons of resources there as well. But I wanted to do this image here of actually the Navajo Times, because I think what it does a good job of is actually capturing the successful and failed efforts of land back narratives, and to think about what have been the pivotal and monumental cases throughout Navajo Nation that really transform our thinking and transforms our thinking about Navajo land back. And so based just reading the Navajo Times and starting to take a crack at all the records management reports, council resolutions, and some of the minutes that are all in English. Obviously this is a time frame that, I'm definitely going to address, but thematically, we've had land losses. We've had land swaps. There are land tensions, even if we garner that back. And so, trying to cover that, then land returns. And then land apathy due to bureaucracy. And so these are some of the themes that I generated just reading through the Navajo Times. But for example, in 1959, the McCracken land swap. This was one that I shared with my class because it just really blew my mind a little bit. But here you can see Chairman Paul Jones in 1959 cutting a fence to join McCracken Mesa to Navajo land. And what's interesting about this is that rather than giving up land, he swapped the land. They approved the swapping of land. Hathathli, actually, the building that this is, who's named after this building, was actually one of the directors back then who sat on the committee that actually approved this McCracken land swap. But this was the first article of the Navajo Times on the first page of the first issue of the Navajo Times. And to me, that just says a lot about how much land was important for the Navajo people. And so here, the story is the US government needed land to build a town at Glen Canyon Dam on the Colorado River in Arizona. Under Paul Jones's leadership, he gave the government 50,000 acres and took over a like amount north of and adjacent to the reservation in Utah. So Norman Little, one of our early attorneys, stated that this was one of the great events of Navajo history, but this was also a brutal period that they were trying to quelch with when Navajos were beaten, hogans were burned, and shots were fired by white stockmen to run Navajo off land where they had lived for many years. So this him here, he's clicking the wire of that land swap. And what I think is important about thinking about Landback, although we're acquiring this other territory of McCracken area, they talk about also how Navajos were, when they came back from the long walk, they naturally went back to space and territory that they used to live in. And so, Navajos who were living there, they were viewed as squatters. There was a lot of labels that were described in this article and some of the reports. And a squatter is someone that is referred to of someone who doesn't actually own or occupy or live in that space. They're viewed as trespassers, and squatters is generally a term that was applied to our own people, even though they were returning back to their original homelands. And so that, to me, indicates that we need to think about how we lost so much through these land swaps. And so I think this is a very important theme that comes out of our discussion about land exchanges. Another theme that I looked at was land returns. In 1959, you can see a picture of Navajo what is now known as Navajo Preparatory School, and I know they don't use this building anymore. But in the Navajo Times, they talked and were celebrating with the Navajo Methodist Mission School, which they used to have a school near Hogback, and then it was established with a tent by 2 female missionaries. Then in 1903, the school was moved and located 4 miles west of Farmington, but a flood destroyed that school, and so they were able to rebuild where Navajo Preparatory School is. But in 1989, the mission sold the Navajo Nation the 82.45 acre site, which is now the home of the Navajo Preparatory School. So when we talk thematically about land returns, it's not this pure, here you go, Navajo Nation, take the land back. We actually had to pay for that territory. We actually inherited, again, remember Goulding's Lodge, we inherited old buildings that were dilapidated. And I know Betty O.J. in 1989, under the leadership of Albert Hill, the late Albert Hill, so under their leadership, they were able to pay and get the council to approve that transaction. And then you also have the late Peter Nits'áá talk about the importance of this school and actually reverting it from the Navajo Academy to the Navajo Preparatory School, which had the vision of actually preparing college students. So, thinking about land back for the Navajo, we have to look at these egregious type of land returns. On the surface, it looks wonderful and great, but for administrators actually running the school, it was a really big headache for them. And one of my other projects with Navajo Prep is actually doing an oral history project for them. And this is part of this initiative to think through, what can we create out of dilapidation, And that's what was kind of offered through this story of the Navajo Prep. And I thought it was really important to highlight this other theme that's been generated just from the research. Obviously, there's a lot of land back ideas, but I was just trying to highlight some of the top ones that popped into my mind. And then there were Landback tensions. We were all familiar with Navajo-Hopi land dispute. So, the language in 1882 was that this land was the use and occupancy of the Makui Hopi and other Indians as this Secretary of Interior. I was just trying to squeeze words in because there's a lot of words. May see fit to settle there. And the Hopis living in their village embraced this place called Land Management District 6. And they contended that their interests are far more extensive and they claimed it all. So this one space that is now that disputed territory of the Navajo-Hopi land dispute, this shows in this article a little bit about that first early court session where the BIA employees actually testified on behalf of the Navajos and the Navajo witnesses to show that the domination, control, use, occupancy, and ownership of the area claimed by the attorneys for the Navajo tribe as rightfully belonging to the tribe, all supported by hundreds of documents, exhibits, maps, and archaeological reports. So when we think about Landback, there's also tension that's created out of it. Intertribal tension that's still long-standing to today. And I know that, a gentleman named Wade Campbell just did a presentation back at Arizona State University and, trying to look at these pueblitos, which was the name designated by Spanish. And so, it caused a real big uproar because people were saying, is he saying that Navajo spaces are actually under the ownership of the pueblos? And then the pueblos were upset that they believed that he was claiming that Navajos were overing on pueblos and their ancestral sites. So that tension eventually got resolved. But in terms of thinking about this Navajo-Hopi land dispute issue, it still has far-reaching implications. I mean, if you look and kind of scope into the Navajo Nation land map, you do still see parts of that dispute happening around Black Mesa and that space there. So I think when I was researching, I wanted to definitely hit on some of the land tensions issues that were happening. So, oops, my theme didn't pop up, but this is the apathy that Navajos have towards land. It's because of the bureaucracy we created. So I wanted to show you my little grazing rights signatures and everything, the paperwork that I had to do for the home site. The bureaucracy is just overwhelming and burdensome. I know, I wrote a chapter of that Nihikeyah about my experience, and I think in terms of looking at the bureaucracy, it is a lot of work. It's very pricey, it's very expensive, and I know that the Navajo Nation under Dr. Nygren's leadership, they are trying to streamline that process. So when we think about this work around bureaucracy, I actually tried to show you a little, I think here, of the process of you getting your survey, your archaeological analysis, getting the letters back and forth of the paperwork, your EPA home site, the different documentation you have to do for your checks. Navajo Nation does not take personal checks, guys. They only take money orders. And then the final lease here and approval. And there's a lot of rules that actually dictate what you can and cannot do on your home site, what you can and cannot build. And I think later, Mr. Paul Spruhan will actually talk about, the layers aspect of these territories. So, as I think a little bit about this project, my next steps actually, I just finally got all the 5 agency approvals to do interviews with all the governing officials. I've already submitted to the UNM IRB, and now I'm pulling the permits and everything together. So hopefully this summer at some point I can actually start doing interviews to add substance to some of these theories around that, because one thing I do know about scholarship, no I'm really critical of this. I mean, I think it really got sharpened this year, is that we need to have more conversations with our community members when we do research. Because drawing from other scholarship, and I know, Western institutions, they believe in this Western canon, where you're building off other research. And Navajo people have a lot of research out there, written by their own Navajo people. And so we're, in essence, building our own canon. But I've also read books that just continually build off regurgitations of other works, which I don't think we are getting fresh and newer stories. And when I think a lot about Diné College building this self to be this premier research institution, I think a lot about, your heart and soul of this place is the Diné Studies program. And I feel that, the students who are learning and engaging in this project, they need tools as well, because, when we think about some of these issues around some of the more modern demands. For example, Navajo Nation Council last year had to talk a lot about the Navajo Equality Act, right? That's a challenge to Navajo people because that's changing and transforming how we understand ourselves as people. But secondly, we're dealing and inheriting a lot of environmental disasters in which a lot of our own people actually sign the approvals for those agreements. And so do we continually blame other agents or corporations, or do we also need to add our leadership and hold them accountable? So I think we need to have scholarship out there that thinks about that. And I know in one of the readings, I think it was Ezra, who said as an attorney, you should never talk negatively about your tribal nation. I mean, if Ezra, if you're listening to this, I know I'm messing this up, but I mean, the point is that we shouldn't talk negatively because ultimately we're trying to build tribal sovereignty, and through building tribal sovereignty, we're trying to build our legitimacy as a nation. And so I think in terms of looking at those perspectives, we have to be really cognizant of where some of those issues are stemming from. But in terms of Diné College itself, building that premierness as this, the heart and soul of our intellectual faculty and leaders, and where things are developed and researched, I really want this place to flourish and to continue to build where it's going. And so I'm really thankful to everyone who's been really supportive for this project, but also my fellowship. And I'm looking forward to seeing whoever the new fellow is. But I'm also really grateful to Kayla Jackson. She's been really great backbone and support for my research, my work here, and handling a lot of the paperwork. I don't like paperwork. But also thank you to our PI and Dean, Dr. Carla Britton. She's been really phenomenal for helping to initiate this project. But also, thank you to Dr. Andrea Christel, Alyssa Landry, and of course, Dr. Monty Roessel for really guiding this. But I really appreciate your time, so I can take questions if I think I have a minute.